18,816 years. Sit with that number for a second, because that's not a typo, and it's not some wild guess a guy made up to sound smart on the internet. That's roughly how far back you have to travel, past pyramids, past written language, past the wheel, before you land on the very first evidence of a human being intentionally shaping another human's hair. No mirror, no chair, no hot towel, just cold stone, colder wind, and someone brave enough to point a sharpened rock at another person's face and say, "Trust me, we're going to go there, all the way back." And by the end of this, the next time you sit down in a barber's chair and complain about waiting 15 minutes for a fade, you're going to feel a little ridiculous because the road to that chair is longer, weirder, and bloodier than almost anything else in human history. Let's start with the obvious question. Why would a species that spent most of its existence worrying about not getting eaten by a cave lion also worry about split ends? Because hair was never just hair. That's the first thing you need to unlearn right now. In the deep Paleolithic, hair was information. It told other members of your group your age, your health, your tribe, sometimes even your rank. A matted, tangled mess wasn't a fashion statement, it was often a walking hazard. Lice, infection, fleas nesting in there like it's a five-star resort. And in a world with no antibiotics, a bad infection from a scalp wound wasn't an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. So somewhere around 20,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries depending on which archaeologist you ask and how strong their coffee was that morning, humans figured out that hair could be managed. Not with scissors, not with razors, with whatever was sharp enough to slice through keratin without slicing through skin. That usually meant obsidian, flint, or in some coastal communities, sharpened seashells. Picture it. No mirrors, no steady hands guaranteed. Just two people, maybe more, sitting near a fire, one holding a blade made from volcanic glass, carefully running it along the other's scalp or jawline. One wrong move, and that's not a bad haircut. That's a medical emergency in a world with zero hospitals. And yet they did it anyway, over and over for thousands of years, refining the process, passing the technique down, generation after generation, long before anyone had a word for barber, long before anyone had a word for much of anything we'd recognize today. This is where the number in the title comes from, because if you trace forward from those early obsidian blade users all the way to the first documented dedicated barbershop-style setup, you're looking at a gap of roughly 18,816 years. Not a symbolic number, not a rounded-up guess. An actual archaeological and historical estimate based on the earliest known grooming tool evidence versus the earliest known commercial grooming establishments. Let that distance sink in. Entire civilizations rose and collapsed in that gap. Entire languages were born and died. And through almost all of it, humans were still out here, cutting hair with rocks. Let's slow down and actually look at those rocks because they're more impressive than they sound. Obsidian, when fractured correctly, can produce an edge that is, in some cases, sharper than surgical steel. Modern surgeons have actually used obsidian scalpels in specific procedures because the edge is so fine it leaves less scar tissue than a metal blade. So when your ancestors were shaving with obsidian flakes 18,000 plus years ago, they weren't using some crude caveman club. They were using, functionally, one of the sharpest cutting tools available to any species on this planet at any point in history. They just didn't have the marketing team to tell everyone about it. Now, here's where it gets a little unsettling, because using a blade that sharp on your own face with no anesthetic, no antiseptic, and no guarantee the person holding it hadn't had a rough week was an act of pure trust. Cutting yourself meant risking infection. Infection meant risking your life. So the person doing the cutting had to be exactly right every single time. This is likely one of the earliest examples of a very specific kind of human relationship: the client and the specialist. Not a hunting partner, not a mate, not a sibling. Someone whose entire temporary job was your appearance and your safety at the same time. That's a strange kind of intimacy, if you think about it. You're trusting a stranger or a semi-stranger to hold something sharp near your throat, and you're doing it on purpose, voluntarily, again and again. Fast forward a bit, and you start seeing this behavior appear independently in places that had zero contact with each other. That's the part that should genuinely blow your mind. In parts of ancient Africa, grooming rituals using sharpened stone tools and even thorns for detailed hair shaping appear in the archaeological and anthropological record extremely early. In parts of what's now the Pacific Northwest of North America, indigenous groups were using sharpened shells and specific fish bones to trim and style hair long before any European contact. In parts of ancient Asia, similarly sharpened tools show up in burial sites next to combs made of bone and ivory. None of these groups were talking to each other. There was no ancient international hair conference where everyone agreed, all right, let's all figure out grooming at the same time. This happened independently over and over because it turns out managing hair wasn't a cultural quirk, it was a universal human need baked into how we function as social creatures. And this is where it gets even more interesting, because grooming wasn't just practical. It became social currency almost immediately. In many early tribal structures, having your hair done, styled, shaped, or shaved by someone else was a marker of status. If you had someone dedicating time and a sharp, dangerous object specifically to your appearance, that meant you had value within the group. Maybe you were a hunter who'd proven himself. Maybe you were someone about to be married. Maybe you were about to take on a leadership role. The haircut wasn't decoration. It was a public announcement. This is honestly not that different from today if you think about it. Someone showing up with a fresh cut before a big interview or a wedding isn't doing it purely for vanity. They're signaling something. This moment matters. I prepared. That instinct is not new. That instinct might be one of the oldest continuously running programs in the human operating system. Let's talk about beards for a second, because beards deserve their own chapter in this story. In several ancient cultures, facial hair wasn't just allowed to grow wild, it was actively shaped, oiled, sometimes even dyed using early plant-based pigments. Archaeologists have found evidence of early grooming oils made from animal fat mixed with crushed plant materials, used specifically to condition and style facial hair thousands of years before anyone had heard the words beard oil marketed on social media by a guy standing in a barn. In ancient Mesopotamia, and we're talking incredibly early Mesopotamian society here, well before what most people think of as ancient history, elaborate beard styling was a serious marker of power. Kings and elite figures had beards that were curled, layered, sometimes even braided with metal thread. This wasn't done casually. This required specialists, people whose entire skill set was managing someone else's facial hair with precision tools. Some of the earliest metal tools ever discovered, dating back to very early Bronze Age societies, include small bronze implements believed to have been used specifically for trimming and shaping hair and beards. Bronze, one of humanity's first major metallurgical breakthroughs, and some of the earliest applications of it weren't weapons. They were grooming tools. Think about that for a second. Humanity spends generations figuring out how to smelt copper and tin together to create a stronger, more durable metal, a genuine technological leap, and one of the first things people do with it is make better hair-cutting tools, before some of the earliest bronze swords, before a lot of early bronze farming tools. Grooming tools were already there, evolving, getting sharper, more precise. This tells you something important about human priorities. We like to imagine our ancestors as purely survival-focused, hunting and gathering and fighting off predators every waking moment. But the archaeological record tells a different story. Even in the middle of that survival grind, there was time, energy, and resources dedicated to appearance, to grooming, to social signaling through hair. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Now let's jump ahead again, because there's a specific transitional period that historians consider crucial in the story of grooming, and it involves ancient Egypt. Egyptian society, extremely early in its development, had some of the most advanced grooming culture in the ancient world. Cleanliness and appearance were tied directly to religious and social status. Priests were required to shave their entire bodies regularly as part of ritual purity practices. Regular citizens, when they could afford it, sought out people specifically skilled in shaving and hair removal. And here's the detail that connects everything back to the number in the title. Egyptian grooming specialists are among the earliest documented individuals whose entire profession, their entire economic role in society, was providing grooming services to others. Not as a side task, not as a favor between friends. As an actual profession, with tools, with technique, with a client relationship, thousands of years before anything resembling a modern barbershop existed. Copper razors have been found in Egyptian burial sites dating back thousands of years, some remarkably well preserved, showing clear signs of regular use and maintenance. These weren't crude tools. They were refined, sharpened, cared for, almost like a modern professional cares for their equipment today. This is genuinely one of the missing links in the story, because at this point you have specialists, you have dedicated tools, you have a clear client relationship. What you don't yet have is a dedicated physical space, a shop, a location people specifically travel to for grooming services. That piece of the puzzle takes even longer to show up. So let's talk about ancient Greece, because this is where things start looking a little more familiar. In ancient Greek city-states, grooming had become deeply intertwined with civic identity. A well-groomed appearance wasn't just personal preference, it was almost a requirement for participating fully in public life. Philosophers, politicians, athletes, all of them cared deeply about how their hair and beards were presented because appearance was read as a reflection of discipline and character. And here's where we start seeing something resembling an actual shop. Ancient Greek cities had dedicated locations where people would gather specifically for grooming services. These spots weren't just functional, they became social hubs. People would sit, wait their turn, discuss politics, gossip, argue about philosophy, all while someone worked on their hair or beard with a blade. Sound familiar? Because this is genuinely one of the earliest examples in the historical record of something functioning almost exactly like a modern barbershop. A dedicated space, a social atmosphere, regular clientele, skilled specialists, conversation as part of the experience, not just the haircut itself. This didn't happen by accident. This happened because humans, when given a space where personal care and social interaction combine, gravitate toward it naturally. We like being taken care of, and we like talking while it happens. That combination, care plus conversation, might be one of the most consistent human behaviors across the entire span of history. From Greece, this concept spreads and evolves through Roman society, where it becomes even more formalized. Roman tonsors, which is genuinely where a lot of grooming terminology traces back to, ran dedicated shops throughout Roman cities. These shops became so central to daily Roman life that going without a shave or a haircut for an extended period was seen as a sign of mourning, poverty, or personal crisis. Appearance, once again, tied directly to social standing. Roman barber shops, and at this point we can actually start using that word without stretching the definition too much, became places where news spread, where political opinions were debated, where business deals were sometimes made. The barber wasn't just a service provider. In many cases, the barber became one of the most socially connected people in an entire community, because everyone eventually needed a haircut. Now here's an important twist in this story, because it's easy to assume this evolution moved in a straight line, steadily improving generation after generation until we arrive at the modern barbershop. That's not what happened. There were entire stretches of history where grooming knowledge regressed, where techniques were lost, where access to skilled specialists became limited to only the wealthiest members of society, while everyone else went back to using whatever sharp object they could find, exactly like their ancestors had done tens of thousands of years earlier. During certain periods in medieval Europe, grooming and medical care became strangely intertwined in a way that feels almost unbelievable today. Barbers weren't just cutting hair, they were pulling teeth, they were performing minor surgeries, they were even conducting bloodletting, a practice based on the incorrect belief that draining blood could cure illness. The red and white striped pole you still see outside some barbershops today actually traces back to this exact era. Red representing blood, white representing the bandages used during these procedures. Think about that the next time you see that spinning striped pole and assume it's just a design choice. It's a visual leftover from a time when getting a haircut and getting a questionable medical procedure happened in the exact same chair, sometimes during the exact same visit. This blending of barbering and medicine lasted for centuries, and it created a strange professional identity. Barbers were respected and feared at the same time. Respected because they held real, practical skills that most people didn't have. Feared because those same skills involved blades, blood, and sometimes questionable outcomes. Eventually, medicine and barbering split into separate professions, largely due to advancing understanding of anatomy, infection, and the growing recognition that maybe the guy trimming your beard shouldn't also be the one performing your surgery. This split happened gradually, over generations in different regions at different times, but it marks a crucial turning point. This is roughly the era where barber starts to mean specifically what we think of today. Someone focused purely on hair, grooming, and appearance. But even after that split, the barbershop as a dedicated, purpose-built physical space, designed specifically and only for grooming, continued evolving for a very long time before it resembled anything close to what you'd recognize walking down a street today. So let's zoom back out and look at the full shape of this story. You start with sharpened obsidian and flint, used by isolated groups scattered across the planet, completely unaware of each other, all independently arriving at the same basic need: managing hair for safety, health, and social signaling. That's roughly where our 18,816-year clock starts ticking. From there, you move through early bronze tools, some of the first metal implements ever created being used for grooming purposes. You move through ancient Egyptian professional grooming specialists, some of the earliest documented people whose entire economic role centered on someone else's appearance. You move through ancient Greek social grooming spaces, where care and conversation first combine into something resembling a modern shop experience. You move through Roman tons or shops, fully formalized businesses with regular clientele and social significance. You move through the strange, bloody medieval period where barbering and surgery blurred into one profession. And eventually, after all of that, after tens of thousands of years of gradual, uneven, occasionally backwards progress, you arrive at something resembling the modern barbershop, 18,816 years. That's the gap between a person nervously running a piece of volcanic glass along another person's scalp near a fire, hoping they don't cut too deep, and a person sitting comfortably in a padded chair getting a precise fade while scrolling through their phone and complaining that the wait time is a little longer than usual. Here's something worth thinking about before we wrap this up. Every single haircut you've ever gotten, every shave, every trim, every awkward, just take a little off the top conversation with a stylist connects backward through an unbroken chain of human behavior stretching back almost 19,000 years. The tools changed, the settings changed. The techniques became infinitely safer and more refined. But the core behavior, one human caring for another human's appearance, using a sharp tool and a steady hand, has never actually stopped. It survived the Ice Age. It survived the collapse of ancient civilizations. It survived plagues, wars, and centuries where most people had no guarantee they'd live past their 30s. Through all of that, somehow, someone somewhere was still cutting hair. That's a strange kind of permanence when you really sit with it. Empires that seemed unshakable eventually crumbled into dust and footnotes in history books. Entire belief systems that people were willing to die for eventually faded into obscurity. But a person sitting still while another person carefully shapes their hair with a sharp object, that never stopped. Not once. Not for nearly 19,000 years. So the next time you sit down for a haircut, and it might feel like a mundane errand, something you squeeze in between work and everything else going on in your life. Remember what you're actually participating in. You are the latest link in one of the longest unbroken chains of shared human behavior that exists. Longer than most religions, longer than most languages currently spoken today. Longer, honestly, than most things humans still consistently do on a regular basis. Somewhere nearly 19,000 years ago, someone sat by a fire, nervous, holding a blade made from volcanic glass, about to do something no one before them had really figured out how to do safely. And it worked. And they did it again. And someone else learned from them. And it kept going and going and going all the way to right now, all the way to you. That's the story behind that number. Not just a random gap in time, but a measurement of just how far back one of our most basic, most consistently repeated human behaviors actually goes. And if there's one thing this entire journey should leave you with, it's a strange kind of respect for something as simple as a haircut. Because it's not simple at all, it never was. It's one of the oldest continuous threads connecting you directly back to people who lived in a world you and I genuinely cannot fully imagine. People who had no writing, no metal tools for most of that stretch, no permanent settlements in many cases, and yet still found the time, the trust, and the steady hands necessary to take care of each other's appearance. 18,816 years. Let that number sit with you for a while, because somewhere in that massive stretch of time, an idea was born that never died. And it's still happening today, in shops on street corners all over the world, carrying forward something that started long before anyone had a word for barber, long before anyone had a word for almost anything at all.